King Charles had finally faced an inescapable reality regarding Queen Camilla's future at Windsor Castle. And those closest to the throne knew that once his mother's sealed instructions were opened, there would be no turning back. What began as a routine administrative review quickly erupted into a permanent royal prohibition. Yet the full truth behind why the late queen took such extraordinary measures remained hidden behind decades of carefully guarded palace history. Before we uncover what really happened behind palace walls, make sure you're subscribed. There are always details the headlines never tell you. But that single legal restriction only makes sense once we return to one quiet room where no amount of royal power could rewrite the past. The heavy oak doors of the administrative wing at Windsor Castle clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the very stone of the ancient fortress. Inside the high-ceilinged room, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet tension that felt almost suffocating. Palace solicitors, dressed in dark formal attire, stood silently around a polished mahogany table. Upon it rested a single, heavily sealed document bearing the unmistakable, deeply etched signature of Queen Elizabeth II. This was not a routine state paper or a polite administrative update. It was a private command designed to outlast a reign, outlive a title, and override any future royal marriage. King Charles sat rigidly at the head of the table, his fingers tightening against the dark wood as he stared at the paper. Beside him, Prince William maintained a stoic, unreadable posture, while Princess Anne observed the proceedings with the sharp, unwavering focus of someone who had spent decades serving the crown without hesitation. Queen Camilla sat slightly apart, her expression shifting from cautious curiosity to profound disbelief as the senior solicitor prepared to break the seal. No one in that room dared to speak, because everyone instinctively understood that the outcome had already been decided long before any of them stepped foot inside the room. The senior solicitor opened the file and began to read aloud, his voice entirely devoid of ornament or emotional softening. Every single word cut through the air with ruthless precision. The late monarch had left behind a permanent, legally binding clause that completely barred Queen Camilla from ever residing at Windsor Castle, holding private apartments within its walls, or exercising any form of household authority inside the estate. The restriction was so comprehensive that it explicitly reached into future widowhood, ensuring that even if King Charles were to pass away first, Camilla would have zero legal right to remain within the castle. Camilla's breath hitched, and the color drained slightly from her face. At first, she had assumed the restriction was merely ceremonial, perhaps a limitation on hosting duties or standing arrangements during formal public events. But the brutal reality of the ban hit her with staggering force. There would be no private office, no overnight stays, no authority over staff appointments, and no future sanctuary within the historic walls that represented the very heart of the British monarchy. For Charles, the moment felt like a physical blow. He was the reigning sovereign, yet he sat completely powerless, trapped between his absolute devotion to his wife and his unbreakable reverence for the mother he still mourned. Without a word, Camilla reached deliberately into her handbag, withdrew her personal Windsor access card, and placed it sharply on the polished table. The sharp click of plastic against wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The solicitor slid the card back toward himself, quietly noting that palace security would deactivate it before sunset. Pushing back her chair with measured dignity, Camilla demanded to know why the late queen had harbored such deep distrust against her. Charles looked downward in heavy silence, while William glanced toward Anne, knowing that a buried family history had finally caught up with them. The emotional fallout of the revelation hung heavily in the air, wrapping around the high stone walls of Windsor Castle like a suffocating mist. Outside, the world moved on with its usual indifference, but inside that administrative wing, time seemed to have completely stopped for the senior royals. The true weight of the restriction was not merely about lost square footage or denied residency. It struck at the core of personal identity, decades of quiet endurance, and the fragile peace they had fought so hard to build. Charles sat motionless, his mind racing through the impossible chasm, opening up between his duties as sovereign and his devotion as a husband. Every instinct told him to defend the woman who had stood beside him through years of public hostility. Yet his hands were tied by a legal mandate that defied even the crown itself. Across the table, William looked on with a quiet, analytical composure. To the future king, Windsor represented much more than a home. It was the unbroken chain of continuity, a sacred trust handed down through generations of monarchs who placed institutional survival above personal desire. He understood why his grandmother had taken such unprecedented steps, viewing the castle not as a prize to be shared, but as a fortress of duty that had to be shielded from any potential shift in authority. Yet, witnessing the sheer devastation on his stepmother's face brought a sharp, uncomfortable reality to the surface. It was a reminder that royal life rarely offered genuine happiness without extracting a heavy emotional toll in return. Camilla, meanwhile, grappled with a profound sense of isolation. Decades of public service, patient waiting, and careful rehabilitation of her public image suddenly felt entirely erased by a single piece of paper bearing a dead woman's signature. She had endured the bitter public rejections, the tabloid scrutiny, and the cold distance of court protocol, always believing that time and loyalty would eventually grant her a secure place within the family's historic heart. Instead, she sat in the very fortress she had hoped to call home. Realizing she was viewed as a permanent outsider, the silence between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken accusations and a deep, aching grief that no royal title could ever soothe. Anne remained the only constant anchor in the room, her expression revealing neither triumph nor sympathy, but rather an absolute, unshakable commitment to the institution. For the Princess Royal, obedience to her mother's final commands was not a matter of personal preference, but an essential duty required to protect the monarchy from internal fractures. She understood that sentimentality was a luxury the crown could ill afford, especially during a time of transition between reigns. As the minutes ticked away, the gulf between personal love and royal obligation widened beyond repair, setting the stage for a reckoning that would test the very foundations of the family. Yet none of them yet understood what had already happened behind palace walls to provoke such an unyielding decree. To understand why the late monarch drew such an unyielding line in the ancient stone of Windsor Castle, one has to look backward through the quiet corridors of time to an event that most outsiders never knew occurred. Years before the solicitors ever unfolded that sealed document, the estate had witnessed a private confrontation that shattered the delicate balance within the royal household. During the final, fragile months of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, the inner workings of the palace began to experience a subtle yet profound shift. Requests from Camilla's expanding household started arriving with increasing frequency at the administrative offices, asking for broader access, additional office spaces, and a stronger voice in upcoming ceremonial planning. At first, these administrative inquiries were handled with polite restraint, as the palace prepared for an inevitable transition of power. But to the late Queen, Windsor was never merely a comfortable residence or a weekend retreat. It was the ultimate living center of command, representing the unbroken legacy of the crown itself. She believed deeply that even the smallest adjustments in staff, assignments, or room allocations could reveal who quietly believed the next reign had already begun before her own time on the throne had formally concluded. Her anxieties were rooted in a fierce desire to protect the institutional autonomy of the monarchy from any premature claims of authority. The breaking point arrived on a quiet evening following a deeply personal memorial reception held at the castle for the late Prince Philip. Amid the lingering grief and solemn atmosphere, an unauthorized directive was quietly issued through Camilla's household, instructing a senior housekeeper to prepare the historic East Terrace rooms for personal use during future gatherings. Those specific rooms carried immense emotional weight, having belonged exclusively to Elizabeth's private living quarters for decades. Reallocating them without the reigning monarch's explicit approval signaled far more than a simple desire for comfort or convenience. It represented an alarming assertion of residential control before surrender of the crown. A shaken housekeeper approached the aging queen late that same night, visibly uncertain and hesitant as she questioned whether the sovereign truly intended to relinquish her private sanctuary while still alive. Elizabeth understood the underlying implication instantly. She did not raise her voice, nor did she summon advisors. Instead, she walked directly to where Camilla was staying and demanded to know who had authorized the sweeping change. When the response came back framed around preparation for future continuity, the queen heard something entirely different, a claim being made to her own domain before permission had ever been granted. With cold precision, Elizabeth took the proposed room assignment sheet, folded it deliberately once without reading a single word aloud, and placed it firmly beneath a heavy silver paperweight before delivering a sentence that would echo through the decades. "These rooms are not waiting for you," she said softly. That very evening, the foundation of the secret clause was forged, But what happened afterward inside those private chambers changed a private warning into an unyielding law. The heavy oak doors of the private drawing room clicked shut, sealing out the rest of the world and leaving Charles and Camilla alone in a silence that felt heavier than stone. All the formal composure they had maintained in front of the solicitors vanished, replaced by a raw, suffocating tension. Camilla walked slowly toward the small table, carrying the historical file with both hands as if it were fragile glass. When she placed it down, her voice remained tightly controlled, yet that very restraint made her words cut through the room with razor-sharp precision. She demanded to know why Charles had kept her in the dark, asking him directly, when he had first realized that his mother was quietly crafting restrictions to strip her of any future role inside Windsor. Charles exhaled a long, ragged breath, running a hand over his face as he admitted the painful truth. He acknowledged that the late queen had indeed raised concerns regarding household boundaries and administrative limits during her final years, expressing deep anxiety over who would control rooms, staff, and daily decisions within the castle walls after her passing. But he insisted vehemently that he had never seen the final, binding text of the clause, believing foolishly that the tension had evaporated entirely following the East Terrace confrontation. To him, it had seemed like a passing moment of royal frustration, rather than a permanent legal trap designed to outlive them all. Camilla refused to accept his defense, her eyes flashing with a mixture of betrayal and deep hurt. She reminded him relentlessly of the immense personal toll she had paid over the decades enduring vicious public scandals, relentless tabloid hostility, social rejection, and endless private humiliation, all while standing faithfully by his side through every storm. Now, she accused him bitterly, he was choosing to protect the untouchable memory of a mother who was no longer there, while leaving the living woman he claimed to love to carry the entire weight of the punishment alone. Her words struck home, driving deep into the core of his deepest insecurities and exposing the impossible divide between his loyalty to the crown and his devotion to his wife. Charles tried to reason with her, his voice dropping to a desperate plea as he explained that openly defying or attempting to tear down his mother's final instruction would inevitably trigger a catastrophic constitutional crisis. He warned her that a public war over royal property rights and household authority would fracture the monarchy beyond repair, pitting the entire institution against the sovereign himself. But Camilla heard no legal logic or protective caution in his plea. She heard only hesitation and cowardice. She heard a husband preparing to sacrifice her future on the altar of royal tradition, leaving her to wonder if she would always remain a tolerated outsider. Yet, before Charles could formulate a response, the heavy door swung open, bringing an even harsher reality into the room. The heavy atmosphere inside the drawing room shifted instantly as Princess Anne stepped across the threshold, holding the second sealed page that had remained hidden beneath the primary legal text. Without offering a single word of comfort or an apologetic glance, she placed the document directly onto the polished wood before the senior solicitor. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, charged with the realization that the true architecture of the late Queen's strategy was about to be laid bare. This second page did not contain vague recommendations, emotional justifications, or polite compromises. Instead, it named the ultimate guardian of the estate. Queen Elizabeth had foreseen that her son, trapped between marital devotion and royal duty, might one day falter when faced with an impossible conflict over his inheritance. To prevent any hesitation, she had completely removed the final decision-making power from his hands. The legal mandate explicitly designated Princess Anne as the permanent family custodian of the Windsor restriction. This authority did not elevate Anne above the reigning monarch, nor did it grant her ownership of the ancient fortress. Rather, it armed her with a narrow, unyielding responsibility to legally block any household order or administrative workaround designed to bypass the late Queen's command. As the solicitor read the binding appointment aloud, the profound weight of the design settled over Charles. His mother had entrusted his sister to enforce a restriction she knew he was too emotionally divided to handle himself. Anne did not look triumphant or victorious. Her expression remained grim, reflecting the heavy burden of duty that denied her the simple comfort of neutrality. Yet, the true shock came when Anne turned the page over to reveal a series of confidential documents detailing recent staffing requests. These papers expose an active, quiet effort to establish a permanent Queen Consort's unit within the castle walls. Such a structure would have consolidated offices, communications, and daily household control under Camilla's direct supervision, without ever formally breaching the rule against private residential suites. It was the exact shadow takeover Queen Elizabeth had feared, a quiet shift of command executed through 1,000 small administrative choices before anyone could sound the alarm. Anne immediately signed a sweeping suspension order, invalidating every pending staff transfer and canceling the planned operational units before sunrise. Handing the pen to her brother, Anne waited with one hand flat against the page. Charles looked up, caught between his desperate desire to protect his wife and the unyielding reality of his sister's legal mandate. With a slow, defeated motion, the king signed his acknowledgement, sealing his mother's intent into active law. When the room finally emptied, Anne lingered for a long moment, staring at her mother's familiar signature as tears gathered in her eyes before she folded the paper and returned to her solitary duty. The institutional machinery had officially taken over, and by dawn, the physical reality of the clause would begin reshaping lives throughout the halls of Windsor Castle forever. The first gray light of dawn had barely begun to touch the ancient stonework of Windsor Castle when the full physical reality of the royal restriction began to take immediate, brutal effect. Corridors that had once hummed with quiet administrative preparation for the new reign were suddenly plunged into an atmosphere of enforced silence and hurried reconfiguration. Security teams received revised access protocols before breakfast, ensuring that electronic passes and clearance codes linked to the Queen Consort were systematically purged from the system. Household managers moved through the administrative wing with grim efficiency, canceling room allocations, removing scheduled transport arrangements, and stripping the castle entirely from Camilla's private calendar. The king's private secretary had been given direct, unyielding instructions to sever all of Camilla's operations from the estate before the sun fully rose above the horizon. Every department was ordered to comply without exception, transforming a legal clause into an undeniable physical reality measured in empty offices, revoked permissions, and silent corridors. Camilla arrived at the administrative wing later that morning, intending to review the final arrangements for her upcoming schedule, only to stop dead in her tracks as she crossed the threshold of the newly prepared office suite. The desks had been completely cleared of documents. Communication equipment had been uninstalled and removed, and nothing remained except a solitary, small box of personal stationery sitting quietly beside the heavy wooden door. Her longtime senior aide stood nearby, visibly shaken and furious at the abruptness of the maneuver, offering immediately to challenge the decision through public legal channels. The aide argued passionately that remaining silent would only make the public humiliation look deserved, inviting endless speculation from the press. But Camilla shook her head with a weary, defeated finality. She knew instantly that launching an open, aggressive attack against Queen Elizabeth's final instruction would only isolate Charles entirely, force William into a harder defensive posture, and compel Anne to enforce the restriction with even greater severity. Choosing a quiet retreat was the only way to prevent a catastrophic family war that the monarchy might never recover from. The final, most humiliating blow arrived with chilling formality when security officials delivered notice regarding future state occasions and public ceremonies. Even during major national events held within the castle, the Queen Consort would be strictly required to depart immediately following the conclusion of the official program, unless Princess Anne granted exceptional, explicit written permission beforehand. Entering the gates as part of the crown was permitted, but remaining behind as family was forbidden. As she walked slowly toward the waiting vehicle, Camilla handed her primary key ring to the security officer, yet one small brass key remained accidentally caught around her finger. She removed it with slow, deliberate care, placed it gently into his open palm, and walked away without looking back once. From an upper corridor window, King Charles watched the dark vehicle pull away from the entrance, his hand rising instinctively toward the glass before falling back down in quiet despair as he realized she could not see him. The heavy silence of the palace felt oppressive, weighing down on him with the full force of a reign defined by duty rather than personal peace. Yet, before the car could even pass through the historic gates, a discreet message arrived from Prince William, requesting a private, unannounced meeting with Camilla alone. The message carried no formal explanations, no administrative demands, and no legal threats. It was simply an invitation that could either trigger a final, bitter rupture or offer the first genuine glimmer of peace the family had experienced since the sealed document was first opened. William did not meet Camilla as a future king confronting a defeated adversary. He met her as a man caught between the heavy ghosts of the past and the uncertain future of the institution he would one day inherit. They sat across from each other in a small, quiet room, tucked quietly beyond the estate's private chapel, completely stripped of lawyers, aides, and family witnesses. For the very first time since the crisis began, the conversation shifted away from cold legal paragraphs, floor plans, and administrative power struggles, moving instead toward the raw, unnameable emotional wounds that neither of them had ever truly addressed out loud. William explained softly that his request stemmed from a deep desire to prevent the restriction from transforming into an ongoing act of personal vengeance that could ultimately tear his father and the entire royal household apart. Camilla listened intently, her guard lowering slowly as she realized the young prince was not there to gloat or press home an advantage. She admitted with a quiet, heartbreaking vulnerability that losing Windsor hurt not because of the luxury or the space, but because it confirmed her oldest and most painful fear. No matter how many decades of public service she logged, no matter how much patient endurance she demonstrated beside the king, she would always remain haunted by the shadows surrounding the origins of their relationship. William did not dismiss her pain or minimize her suffering. Instead, he gently reminded her that Windsor carried the heavy emotional echoes of his grandmother's life and the profound trauma of his own mother's memory, making the fortress a sacred trust of continuity rather than a prize of war. Recognizing the immovable reality of the institution, William offered a practical and dignified settlement. Camilla would retain her full ceremonial status and receive an independent, fully supported household elsewhere, while the private guardianship of Windsor would remain anchored strictly to the direct line of succession. In exchange, she agreed to halt any public or legal challenges against the late Queen's directive. As the meeting drew to a close, Camilla touched the wooden table and whispered that she wished this conversation had taken place years earlier. William promised to carry the agreement directly to his father, knowing that while the private compromise saved their family from total collapse, the outside world was about to discover a secret that would shake the entire nation. The fragile peace brokered behind closed doors could not withstand the relentless pressure of the outside world for long, and by sunrise, the secret broke through palace walls to become a global storm. Britain woke up to a sensational royal restriction unlike anything announced in modern memory, capturing front-page headlines and dominating broadcast networks from dawn until dusk. The public did not receive the story as a dry, technical dispute over estate management or paperwork. They saw it as a dramatic final command delivered across time by Queen Elizabeth, a direct rebuke that forced the nation to confront deep wounds the crown had spent decades trying to contain. Commentators and royal experts filled television studios, dissecting every possible angle of the family crisis, while crowds gathered outside the historic Henry VIII Gate to discuss the breaking news. To manage the escalating chaos, the palace was forced to act with unprecedented speed, issuing a formal statement before speculation could completely outrun institutional control. The brief press release confirmed that the late monarch had indeed created a binding private residential instruction, and that King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Queen Camilla had collectively agreed to respect its terms. While the official wording was carefully crafted to sound calm and measured, its underlying meaning was utterly devastating to the public image of the monarchy. News anchors repeatedly explained that while Camilla would retain her title as queen consort and continue her public duties side by side with the king, every residential privilege, unsupervised visit, staffing power, and long-term connection to Windsor Castle had been permanently severed. Reaction across the country was sharply divided, reflecting deep public ambivalence toward the queen consort and the institution itself. Staunch supporters of the late queen praised the restrictive clause as a masterclass in institutional protection, arguing that safeguarding the historical sanctity of the crown's primary fortress was far more important than accommodating personal relationships. Conversely, critics and sympathetic observers condemned the move as a final, calculated humiliation inflicted upon a woman who had spent years supporting Charles through intense public hostility, relentless media scrutiny, and unrelenting judgment. The debate quickly transcended ordinary gossip, turning into a nationwide discussion on the limits of royal power, the ghost of past traditions, and the heavy price paid by those who married into the House of Windsor. Inside the royal residence, King Charles watched the relentless media coverage unfold in heavy, unbroken silence, refusing to react to the swirling storm of commentary that framed the situation as his late mother's ultimate victory over his wife. Understanding the immense emotional strain her brother was enduring under the public microscope, Princess Anne deliberately appeared beside him at a subsequent official engagement, standing close enough to send an unmistakable message to the media and the public alike. Their visible solidarity proved that despite the heavy burdens imposed by their mother's final instructions, the core sibling alliance remained entirely unbroken. Soon after, the palace released details of the negotiated settlement between William and Camilla, confirming that she had voluntarily abandoned any legal challenge in exchange for an independent household. Yet, as the crowds watched a solitary car pass by Windsor without entering, everyone understood that the monarchy had entered a profoundly new era where private love would forever bow to public duty. The ultimate test of this fragile new reality did not take place within the sterile confines of a lawyer office or behind closed palace doors, but rather at the ancient and solemn gates of Windsor Castle itself. When the Queen Consort returned to the historic estate to attend a high-profile national memorial service, she did so under the exact terms of the newly established agreement. Every single step she took carried the immense psychological weight of public exclusion and institutional reality. She arrived not as a resident or a master of the household, but strictly as an invited consort and a senior member of the royal family participating in a public act of remembrance. Official protocols dictated that her entry must occur through the public ceremonial entrance, the formal route designated exclusively for state duties rather than private domestic life. As her vehicle passed beneath the imposing stone archways, onlookers watched with breathless intensity, well aware that Windsor was no longer a place she could ever call home. King Charles walked closely beside her, his body language communicating a quiet, unwavering message to the watching world. By standing firmly at her side, the king made it unmistakably clear that respecting his late mother's unyielding legal instruction did not require him to abandon his wife, nor did it mean denying her basic human dignity and public respect. Yet, the emotional peak of the visit occurred away from the cameras in a quiet corridor just out of sight of the public eye. Camilla paused for a long, poignant moment near the intersection leading toward the private apartments where she had once hoped to establish her permanent headquarters. She gazed down the hallway, fully recognizing that she would never cross that domestic threshold again as a member of the resident household. Princess Anne approached her without a trace of triumph or personal satisfaction in her expression. The Princess Royal spoke with calm directness, acknowledging that enforcing their mother's strict clause had caused profound pain, but insisting that their shared duty was always to protect the institution from personal ambition. Camilla responded with a striking display of quiet finality and grace. She confirmed directly to Anne that she would never seek residential access to Windsor again, bringing a definitive close to months of internal turmoil. Before turning away, Camilla presented a signed formal document officially dissolving the proposed Queen Consort Administrative Unit, completely dismantling the staff structure that would have given her enduring influence within the castle. William watched from a short distance as his aunt accepted the final piece of paperwork, noting the profound relief written across both of their faces. In a surprising moment of unexpected humanity, Princess Anne paused and extended her hand toward her sister-in-law. Camilla accepted the gesture without hesitation, sealing a fragile peace built on mutual endurance rather than forgotten grievances. Charles observed the silent exchange from across the room, watching the two women finally release years of deep-seated hostility. It was a transformative moment that proved the late Queen's harsh clause had not destroyed the royal family after all. Instead, it had drawn a permanent, unbreakable boundary between personal affection and institutional duty, allowing the ancient monarchy to survive its most delicate modern crisis with its core dignity fully intact. The heavy iron gates of Windsor Castle swung slowly shut, sealing the historic fortress against the fading evening light and marking the final chapter of a constitutional storm that had shaken the British monarchy to its very foundations. Looking back across the tumultuous weeks of legal disclosures, closed-door confrontations, and public speculation, the true magnitude of what had transpired became strikingly clear. The institution of the crown had successfully protected its ancient legacy, ensuring that the sacred corridors of power and residence would remain anchored strictly to the direct line of succession. Yet this profound preservation of tradition had exacted a heavy toll, permanently altering the personal dynamics within the royal family and forcing every key participant to redefine their place within the hierarchy. King Charles emerged from the crisis carrying the quiet, enduring grief of a sovereign caught permanently between two irreconcilable worlds. He had honored his mother's final, unyielding command while keeping his marriage intact. But the victory felt hollow. defined by what had been permanently lost rather than what had been saved. He remained on the throne, steering the ship of state through turbulent waters, but the private sanctuary he had hoped to share with his wife had been cordoned off by history itself. His quiet endurance demonstrated the ultimate sacrifice required of a modern monarch, proving once again that personal desires must always bow before the relentless demands of institutional continuity. Princess Anne and Prince William stood firm as the steadfast guardians of that continuity. Having successfully defended the boundaries established by the late Queen, Anne bore the heavy burden of enforcement without seeking personal glory, carrying out her mother's final instructions with an uncompromising devotion to duty that shielded the crown from internal fractures. William, stepping naturally into his role as a future king, proved capable of bridging the dangerous gap between emotional family conflicts and cold institutional necessity. By negotiating a dignified settlement, he ensured that the monarchy would move forward into its next era without the corrosive distraction of an ongoing civil war within its inner circle. For Queen Camilla, the outcome marked a profound and painful acceptance of reality. She had lost the castle that might have served as the ultimate symbol of full acceptance and historical validation. Yet, in choosing dignity over a bitter, unwinnable conflict, she achieved something far more valuable than residential rights. She earned a hard-won respect that administrative power could never command. By stepping back, relinquishing her administrative units, and accepting her role strictly as an invited ceremonial consort, she removed the threat of division and allowed the family to heal its deepest fractures. The heavy stone walls of Windsor remained safely beyond possession, untouched by marital shifts or changing reigns, exactly as Queen Elizabeth II had always intended. The marriage survived, the crown held firm, and the ancient fortress stood resilient against the passing tides of time. As the last echoes of the evening bells faded across the Berkshire countryside, the gates closed behind a turbulent era of royal history, leaving the monarchy secure in its traditions, forever shaped by a dead woman's final, unyielding command.